Our reading this morning comes from Exodus chapter 14. And as Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites, they looked back. And there were the Egyptians advancing on them. And in great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing that we told you in Egypt? Let us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But then Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. The Egyptians, whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still."
I wasn't really quite ready for fall yet, but look at that. You guys have made me believe in October. The color, it looks like a group of moms, doesn't it? It's awesome, thank you. I'm ready for fall now. See, there is a way out. And we've been talking about that way out of no way for the last 3 weeks. This is our 4th week out of a 6-week series. And we have been exploring how God is creating a relationship with all of creation. Not just us, but all of creation. Through all the natural elements of water and fire and earth and all the things that make up creation, as well as the people, the humanity, God's people in the world. We watched as God cleansed the earth and brought us all to new life through the waters of Noah and the ark. We watched also how the covenant got established through Abraham and Sarah as they were called out to begin a new nation, a nation of God's people reconciled into God's blessing and God's love, to be a blessing to the rest of the world. And we watched as God was continually present with Joseph, as Joseph was in and out of good and bad situations, all of which were foreign to him, and all of which should have given him reason to give up. And yet, knowing that God's covenant was made, he trusted it and demanded a blessing of the situations that he was in. And in doing so, ended up reconciling that nation of God's people again so that they too could come out of the struggle of the famine and become a blessing to the rest of the world. God is capable and ready and willing to participate with us in creation, to make a way where there is no way. So our question today when we're dealing with the Red Sea is exactly what is our role in working with God in making this way out of no way? Do we have one? Do we trust God? Yes. Do we act when needed? Most definitely. So what does that look like? And as we go forward, to be a blessing to the nations, what is our role? What is our responsibility? Trusting in God is a huge part of that responsibility and that role. Throughout history, we have had several different stories that have talked about God's capabilities, right? God's grandeur in all of creation, through the creation story and all the way through Noah's Ark and the deliverance over and over and over again in our lives. This story is probably the most well-known of all those stories. This is Moses delivering the people through the Red Sea by God making a way out of no way. Now, throughout history and throughout many different faith traditions, there are tons of stories about how God interacts with God's people in order to save them, to move them and shift them to a whole new direction of living in the world. And those stories come out of the Quran, they come out of the Hindu tradition, they come out of Chinese Buddhism. There's a couple different traditions that I read about from the Hindus. And then, our own story about Moses and the Israelites, right? The whole Exodus story about how God convinces Pharaoh through miraculous events to let the people go and then actually provides a way for them to get away. Those stories are a tradition for the whole world, for all faith traditions, not just ours. So how is God interacting in our traditions? How are we a part of it? Can we get any clues from some of these other traditions? From the Hindu tradition, united with me you shall overcome all difficulties by my grace. God is there, but so are we. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. God's working through the Spirit in us. That's our own tradition. Oh, you who believe, if you help God's cause, he will help you and make your foot hold firm. That comes from the Quran. Believers are participating with God. To those who have conformed themselves to the way readily lends its power. To those who have conformed themselves to the power readily lends more power. That's the Tao Te Ching. And more from Buddhism, which I love this because it's called the elegant sayings. Men of little ability too, by deepening upon the great, by depending upon the great, may prosper. A drop of water is a little thing, but when will it dry away if it is united with a lake? We are the drops of water, but united with a lake, think of the possibilities. Our story today about crossing the Red Sea begins with God making a statement to Moses that it's time for the Israelites to be free. And Moses says, how could I possibly do that? I don't even need to tell you this story because the song did it, right? But I'll remind you that Moses and Pharaoh grew up together. They were friends. Then they struggled with one another. And Moses was told he was supposed to let these people go. Pharaoh said no. God came in and convinced Pharaoh through a series of plagues that he needed to let go of the Israelites and send them to freedom. It was the very last plague, the plague where his oldest son dies, that convinced him. And in the depth of his grief, he finally looked at Moses and he said, go ahead, gather your people together, gather your things and get out. So Moses did that. He gathered the people, they hurriedly got their stuff together, everything that they could take with them, and started moving. They needed to move fast because they knew that this decision from Pharaoh was a temporary one. That once Pharaoh rose up a little bit out of his grief and moved into that anger stage, he was going to come after them. And they wanted to be well gone by that time. So they didn't take the main routes to where they needed to go. They wanted to stay away from those because they knew that Pharaoh would come running. And those roads were made specifically for Pharaoh's chariots. They would gain on them in no time flat. So they head out for the Sinai wilderness. They head out trying to get lost. They wanted to get so far ahead of Pharaoh that they could never catch up to him. And by the time they did, they would be lost in the wilderness where nobody could find them. And they wouldn't have to ever return to slavery. But there was something standing in the way. On that route to the Sinai wilderness, there happened to be a sea. People didn't ask for the details. They trusted Moses to some extent. They never really thought he was a great leader, but they followed him because they were free. So they ran as fast as they could with everything that they could carry until they came to the sea. And they figured Moses had a plan, boats, barges, something, right? Some way to get across. Nothing. No boats, no barges, no people waiting for them to help them find a different route. And the people turn around and they see Pharaoh's dust rising and coming closer and closer as the chariots are gaining ground. The people say to Moses at this point, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." With the chariots coming, they didn't have much choice. As they're looking around for alternative ways, maybe even finding a really gentle smile to be able to surrender nicely to the Egyptians so they don't get slaughtered where they are, Moses turns to the people and replies, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Keep still? We're at the edge of death and slaughter, and we're supposed to stand still and take it? What are you talking about? We have spent months preparing for this day of freedom. You promised us that we could get free. We suffered the plagues all but the last one. And now is our moment. Now is our time. We've picked up everything and we followed you only to stand still? What is wrong with you? But Moses stands still. Moses says, "Do not be afraid." Moses expects to see the deliverance that the Lord will make a way for. Do you remember a story a couple weeks ago where Eric was talking about the fall of Satan in the Quran? Where he said that the angels and the jinn were all looking to God, and so when God told them to bow down to the imperfect creations or humans that were made, all of them were looking to God and they bowed down. But Satan said, "These people, this humanity is imperfect. I will not bow down." Satan wasn't looking at God. Satan was checking out the imperfections, was obsessed with it. And that's when he fell. That's when all of us fall. When we stop looking to God and start looking for escape routes, we fall. And there's always that inevitable moment where you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You're stuck between the evil that you know, and you're hovering right around that mystery that is way beyond our imaginations, and we have no idea what to do. The only thing we can do is listen for God. Sit still, keep still, and listen. Wait for God. Expect God to do something. God already is doing something. We're meeting God. That's what they're called to do. How many of us do that? Especially with chariots bearing down on us. Do you ever practice that in your life? Or do you wait for those really serious situations where there is no other way? That you have to sit there and sit on your hands and not do anything. How can we practice sitting still, keeping still, looking for God? Let's do that right now, shall we? Everybody sit up straight. Put your feet on the floor. There's a story that Eric told during the worship planning this week that talks about his dog, Ro. This is not Ro, but this looks like Ro. Ro is his dog that they saved from the streets. And Ro has a problem with sitting still. Ro's always moving. Especially at nighttime when they're trying to go to bed, Ro climbs up on the bed and just jumps around. And it takes Eric's hand to reach out and hold on to him with just enough pressure that the dog knows he's there. And the dog begins to breathe a little bit deeper. And finally, the dog gives up and goes, and then the dog settles in and goes to sleep. Eric knows he has to wait for that moment when the dog breathes in deep and sighs deeply. I have the same story, but my story is with my daughter, Rachel. My daughter Rachel's birthday is today. She's 24 years old. And I don't remember really rocking her to sleep, but I do remember it was a challenge. She never did go to sleep. I literally have a picture of her like this on the floor because she was running and dropped. Sitting still for her is not an option, really. So rocking her to sleep was always a challenge. I had to hold her just tight enough so she knew I was there, that she was safe, that she could breathe deeply. And after much squirming, she would finally take that breath so deep and let that heavy sigh out and let my soothing song rock her to sleep. That's that moment when you're intently listening for God's voice. So as you sit, rest your hands on your thighs and press down just gently on your thighs. And breathe a couple breaths in. And let it out. Breathe in. And let it out. I'm going to repeat a phrase from Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. And after each phrase, I'd like you to do that breathing in and that exhale. And as you do that, think about all those things that might be keeping you from being still, from hearing God, from recognizing God in your life. And as you exhale, let go of those things. The pride, the fear, the frustration, the anger, the resentment, whatever it is that blocks your path. Practice listening for God and letting that go. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know that I. Be still and know. Be still and. Be still. be. Be still. Be still and be still and know. Be still and know I. Be still and know I am. Be still and know I am God.
I ask that you keep your eyes closed, focusing on that breathing, and listen to the rest of this scripture story. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them. All of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left.
The story of the crossing of the Red Sea is the story of God's people learning to accept their role in creation, learning to allow God's role in creation. It's a story of people moving from fear to awe, people moving from shouts of despair to shouts of joy and worship. It's a story that moves us from slavery into freedom. All of God's people together, reconciled in a new way of being in the world. God is constantly creating a new way, and we help in that. We are part of that creation because we are given the freedom to live into our most fullest expression of who we are. We get to live that out. Freedom in this sense is talked about in the Old Testament in this story through the Red Sea and the Exodus, as well as in the Muslim traditions, as well as our Christian traditions in the New Testament. Paul says, "For freedom Christ has set you free." Freedom to be who we were created to be and to let God be God. My husband, who's also a pastor, has this phrase he uses all the time. He says, freedom is the gift. Living into freedom is the work. Now, there are two other professors that he works with or has worked with in the past, Ralph Klein and Dennis Olson, who talk about this story about the Red Sea and how this is a living into our freedoms. They talk about the different stories in Exodus, the one story of the Red Sea that is actually broken down into two different versions. One is very clear about what God is doing in the story. That's the priestly version. And that talks about how God provides the cloud and the pillar, and through the pillar of fire confuses the Egyptians, and they fall into the water and drown. It's all about what God is doing. And in the second tradition is the tradition about how God moves the Israelites through the leadership of Moses. Moses is the one that reaches out with the staff and opens the waters so that the people actually walk through. In the first tradition, there's no crossing. It's all about what God is doing. In this tradition, the people are involved. God's purposes are worked out through imperfect, everyday, ordinary people of God. Now, what they have in common is that these two traditions have been blended into this Exodus story, and both of them stand together. And everyone in the theological community around this issue has said that the reason why that happened is because these two tensions, God's ability and our participation, need to stand in tension with one another to bring creation into its fullest expression. If we are going to be who God created us to be, in relationship with one another and with God and all of creation, then we work together. God doing God's part, us doing our part. So what does our role look like? And how does this story help us to understand that? This is prayer. This is meditation. This is our role. Does it sound like the Israelites running up to the sea and saying, now what? Now what? What do we do now? What do we do? Do we swim? Moses says, wade into the water. Expect that God is already there. God will deliver you this day. Be still. Keep still. Stand firm. Is this passive? Does this mean we don't do anything? Have you ever heard the phrase, don't just stand there, do something? This story stands in direct challenge to that phrase. That's so much our way of being in the world, right? Our society says, don't just stand there, do something. But even as far back as the Hebrew scriptures, we're being told your role is not passive by any means. It's intentional. You are doing something, but what you're doing is listening for God. Learning to look for the patterns in life that in your lived experience show you over and over again that God's presence is with you and is making a way for you that you never knew existed. Our participation in that is to intently listen, to start recognizing God's activity in the world, to listen for it, to converse with others, to help discern it, to be actively engaged in the world in a way that allows God to be present with you, rather than taking things into your own hands and looking toward the dust of Pharaoh's chariots instead of into the water where God is already moving. That is not passive. That is active listening. That's being engaged in the world. We're not doing nothing. We are not doing nothing. We're doing something. We're engaging with the activity of God. Sometimes that means listening. And sometimes it means keeping still. And you shouldn't wait until the chariots are bearing down on you to practice that. You should already be doing it every day of your life, looking for God in the world, trying to figure out how you might participate in what God is already doing. Learn to expect that God is already there. How can we be present with God? That is our role. How does that happen? Through God's love. Through the three great loves, right? The love of God, the love of neighbor, the love of self. That's what we're called to do. That's intentionally living. But listening for how God does that and how we participate in that. Our activity is always in response to what God is already doing. Our role is to be with God in this, actively engaging in God's love for the world. And that comes out in many different ways. How do we know when we're not following in God's love? We tend to isolate ourselves. We tend to box ourselves in to the point where the Spirit has trouble finding a way through. We cut off our relationships. We concentrate on our goals, our futures, our line, our destination. And it's not until we realize that our ideas are not connecting us to anything. We might have 2 cars and a boat in the garage. It might look like wonderful success. But who are we sharing that with? Do we find the time to enjoy it? Have we cut ourselves off from everything that means something to us in order to achieve those things? Is that where God is already moving? Or are we alone in that? Pay attention. Sit up. Breathe deep. Watch for God. Expect that God is already there. How can we participate? That is our role. That's a way to love. When you can find no other way, follow the Spirit of God into that love, and God will show you that way. Get to that point where inevitably all of us are caught between that evil that we know versus the mystery that we have no idea what stands out there for us. And be still. Stand firm. Wait for the Spirit to open our options. Wait for the Spirit to direct us to an obvious direction. Participate in what God is already doing. Take that time every day to listen, to practice being intentional about your awareness. And then when it's time to move, wade in the water. Expect to find God there. And know that God is already making a splash. Amen.